So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Please welcome Lucia Fogler. Did I do it right? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, hopefully. Our webinar presenter today. And I'll let her introduce herself in just a minute. So her presentation is going to be approximately a half an hour long, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So if you could please hold your questions until then, that would be great. So thank you. Let's get started, and I will pass the virtual mic to Lucia.
Sounds good. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucia Fogler. I'm a student at the University of Virginia, studying public policy as well as global security with a China East Asia minor. Most of my research has been focused on China, and this is due mainly because I've had some on-the-ground experience within East Asia that really inspired me to conduct research in this area. And then within my research, I have been able to have experience working and working with and briefing professionals from across the government, private, and academia sectors. So I'm super excited to be here today with everyone and to present my research and my findings. And so as we get started, I'm going to go over a little agenda just to see where we're going to go with this presentation. So I'm going to start with a background, and this is important in order to understand the current infrastructure as well as the landscape that is important to understanding then the implications of my research. So mainly we'll focus within the background on the defense sector and critical minerals, as well as the US and China's influence within Oceania. Then we'll look at China and the US's position on deep sea minings because they both approach it from different angles. Then we'll go into the policy implications, and this is what my research kind of focused on and what the result of my research was. And then from there, each one of these implications I'll analyze a little bit as well as provide some of my recommendations. So we begin with this question on why deep sea mining is important to the US defense sector. And there was really these two central reasons that I focused my research on. The first one was that the defense industrial base relies on critical minerals for their productions, as critical minerals are found in many key defense technologies. So I'll go into this a little bit more in a second. But going into point number two, deep sea mining is also important to the US defense sector in order to retain power structures and influence that the US has within Oceania. And so a lot of today we'll be talking on point number two and this idea of retaining power structures. So going back to that point number one, the DoD and NATO recently created two separate lists identifying key critical minerals that are important to US national security as well as defense manufacturing. When these two lists were compiled together, there was around 16 key critical minerals that the two lists together compiled. And these critical minerals are important in many different areas of defense manufacturing. So for example, a mineral such as antimony is present within night vision goggles, as well as within the hardening and strengthening of metals. You have tantalum that is present within a lot of global positioning systems. And then your rare earth elements are seen within precision guided weapons and stealth technology as well. And so when it comes to the terrestrial critical mineral production, China holds prominence in many of the sectors within many of the supply chains within these critical minerals. So this could be their dominance within mining, refinement, or processing. And so out of these 16 critical minerals, it was seen that China holds prominence in 14 out of 16, and at least one of these three areas of a supply chain. Looking at the graph that is on the left, the orange bar shows how much the US relies on imports of these specific minerals. The blue bar that's underneath it shows out of our import reliance, how much we import specifically from China. And then the cool thing about all of these 16 critical minerals that were identified was that 100% of these critical minerals are found in some part of the ocean. They're all found in differing quantities, but they can be accessed through various means of ocean mining. So again, this is a potential new market for the US government to kind of expand into. And then going to reason number 2 again, focusing on influence and power structures. We're starting here with a base map of the Pacific and the Pacific Oceania. Oceania is composed of 3 different regions. You have Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. But what you see on this map here is the 3 island chains. The island chains are a theory, a defense theory that goes back to the Cold War and the containment of China and the Soviet Union at the time. So basically the idea was that with the 3rd island chain was the last line of defense for the US in order to contain the Chinese and the Soviet Union at the time. The 3 island chains are still important theory today, but many people are thinking about it now in terms of a defense structure as well as our kind of areas and lines of influence. So for example, within the 1st island chain, we have military bases that I'll show you, and then 2nd island chain and 3rd island chain, so on and so forth. Today, it serves as a point of military pressure on China and an influence on the surrounding island nations, because many of the surrounding island nations rely on the US's presence for support and autonomy. And then as you'll see as well, there is also this potential idea that there is an eroding of the island chain's effectiveness and its influence as China is trying to spread their influence more within Oceania. Within my research, I'm specifically looking at the 2nd and 3rd island chains, which is mainly what Oceania is comprised of. So looking first at the US states and territories, this is the central thing that makes up the island chain theories. So within Micronesia, you have Guam, you have the Northern Mariana Islands, the Midway Islands, and then in Polynesia, you have Hawaii and American Samoa. Now, you might have noticed that I did not mention Melanesia. This is an area that is critical lack of US presence, and the US historically has not focused its attention heavily on this area, mainly due also to the thought of that Australia is there in order they can provide a presence in that region. The other thing that's really important to note about the US states and territories is our exclusive economic zones, and which is 200 nautical miles from shore. And this is where US has our economic rights within, and this is where a lot of our deep sea mining comes into play, as we will see. Next, we have our US military bases. And these are the installations that have been created to re-strengthen US presence and provide additional security protections and military power. So they're important to give more of a hard power to our states and territories. So you have military installations in Guam, the Wake Island airfield, the Kwajalein Atoll, as well as within Hawaii. And then the last part of thinking about the US installations and infrastructure within Oceania is thinking about the US Compacts of Free Association. These are also known as COFA, and these Compacts of Free Association are US security agreements with Pacific Island countries where the US gains exclusive military access to the region and provides to the defense of these countries. So this is mainly done through the use of the Coast Guard protecting these countries. Yes, and so then the other important thing about this is that these countries also gain economic assistance from the US in order to support their development as well. So you have Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. Now switching gears to looking at China's diplomatic and defense presence in Oceania. China, you have to think about their kind of influence as well as their infrastructure in Oceania in a different sense, as they don't have any territories within Oceania, as well as they don't have any military bases, any international military bases that are positioned within Oceania. And so they rely on diplomatic partners as well as defense partners in order to establish influence within the region. So looking first at China's security agreements. China's security agreements are a lot like the US's Compacts of Free Association. The thing that differs the most with those is that rather than being more of a defense, it's more localized police forces on the ground, as well as support and assistance on the ground rather than defense presence within the waters. But these are still important because they're an area that China invests heavily economically into. So these three countries are the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, and Vanuatu. And now looking towards the deep sea diplomatic collaborations that China has created. So the first one is the Cook Islands. And this is important because China has signed a memorandum of understanding for the combined research and development into deep sea mining within the Cook Islands, specifically within its exclusive economic zone. This is also important too because China has collaborated with the Cook Islands to use their ISA contract areas within the Clarion-Clipperton zone. But then there's also some other partners that China has looked towards, such as, again, Kiribati, Tonga, and Papua New Guinea. And these are all areas that China is eyeing and looking towards expanding their deep sea mining within, or their collaborations on mining within their exclusive economic zones. So these are all areas that people are watching right now and keeping an eye on. And really what's important here is just the economic investments that China is putting into these specific island countries, both through diplomacy and security agreements. And then kind of the last portion of looking at China's installations and influence is their deep sea research areas. Now, China has contracts that have been given to 3 companies. We're really going to focus on 2, which is the Beijing Pioneer Corporation and the China Minerals Corporation that has contract areas within the Clarion-Clipperton zone. And so these are International Seabed Authority mining contract areas. And they're really important to note because, again, they're not a typical sphere of influence that you would think. But as we'll get into further, the use of research and the potential for dual use technology use within these deep sea research areas is really important for the US to keep an eye on as well. So now looking at deep sea mining, specifically, the US and China both approach this in a very different ways. So as many of you might know, the US fuels their the deep sea mining more as a commercial enterprise in which the US government has been increasingly putting funding into, as well as an area, an emerging area where the US government is able to lease contract areas within our own exclusive economic zones. So it is a commercialized and civilian enterprise. Where on the other hand, China, the way they approach it is a little different and is more done again through a civilian lens, but it's done through state-owned enterprises, and these enterprises are heavily intertwined with the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, and the PRC, or the People's Republic of China's government. So they are civilian, but there is a potential of this thought of, again, dual use technology and civil military fusion within deep sea mining. And then going back to the US, the US is limited in our availability and our participation in deep sea mining. And this is specifically because we are not an ISA signatory, since we did not sign the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas in the 80s. So this severely limits us in our availability and our participation within specifically deep sea mining. But under the EO 14285 that came out in April, which is also known as Unleashing America's Offshore Critical Minerals and Resources, this allows US mining in areas beyond a national jurisdiction. So this hasn't necessarily come to fruition yet, but is an important area as it's faced significant international legal disputes as well. China, on the other hand, as I mentioned, is an ISA signatory. And then they have 5 contracts that have been given to 3 corporations. And these corporations are China Minerals Corporation, Beijing Pioneer High-Tech Development Corporation, and China Ocean Minerals Resources Research and Development Association. But China hasn't just stopped with their ISA contract areas in looking for a place to deep sea mine or just mine in general. They've also looked towards diplomatic partnerships, as I mentioned, and the ability to mine within those Pacific Island countries' exclusive economic zones. So going now to my methodology on how I conducted my research. So specifically, I used in the majority of my research, I used open source documents, current academic literature, as well as government publications. And when I was looking at all these documents and resources, I noticed that there was a lack of analyzing these documents together rather than in separate silos. So for example, many of the research people were mainly looking at either China's research vessel movements, but they weren't looking at the Chinese research vessel movements in addition to where China's ISA contract sites were. There's also a lack of literature that was analyzing the two countries' mining strategies in comparison to one another. It was mainly literature that was focused on specifically on China's vessel movements or specifically focused on US mining in a specific area or interest within a specific area, such as expanded mining inquiry into American Samoa. And so basically what I did was when I took all this data together, I overlaid the data in order to see what trends emerged subsequently in relation to the literature that was already out there. So what I used a lot of was geographic mapping, and I compiled the ISA contract sites. So in each ISA contract site, there's a list of the coordinates, which you can see on the right-hand side, the bottom right. This is an example of what the list of coordinates look like. And when you plot it on the map, it looks like the lower shape in the upper right-hand corner. And so this is by Beijing Pioneer C1 contract area plotted on the map. And so in using these ISA contract site coordinates, as well as government and executive orders that also have some of these geographic site coordinates for the US, I was able to analyze the overlapping areas of interest. And then it's important to also note some of the limitations that I faced within my research. So there's definitely a lack of Chinese government documents or state-owned enterprise documents. And so I had to rely more on the actual data points, such as these vessel movements, the geographic coordinates, rather than specific publications. And so in doing this research, I came to 3 policy implications. The first implication is that, and I'll go more into depth about each one of these in a minute, but the first one is that the PRC, through their use of dual-use technology and diplomatic buildup on deep-sea mining, is creating a coordinated strategy to build up U.S. influence, or to build up their influence to counter U.S.'s established spheres of influence. And then the second one is that the use of dual-use technology and civil-military fusion is being used within the PRC's dual-use deep-sea mining strategy, and this again aims to survey U.S. military posture and to interfere with civilian infrastructure. And then the third implication is that the PRC is looking to the deep-sea mining industry in order to establish a competitive advantage over the deep-sea mining industry, and with the potential to undercut the U.S. out of the critical mineral market. So going to the first implication, this idea that the PRC is building up their diplomatic and defense partnerships to counter the U.S. influence. So when I plotted the contract area sites, there was a trend that emerged. So for each U.S. strategic partner or military installation, there was a PRC deep sea mining and research area or a Pacific Island country that partnered with the PRC strategically within diplomacy or defense. And so starting with the map that is on the left of the screen, you see the territory of the U.S. territory of American Samoa. The U.S. has Army Reserve presence here, but this is mainly the site, more importantly, of where there's expanded looking into establishing mining within its exclusive economic zone. And this is shown by this blue shape right here. This is the proposed location that the US is looking into mine within the exclusive economic zone. So as you might notice on this map, China has strategically identified in close proximity to American Samoa, Tonga, which is to the southwest, and the Cook Islands, which are to the southeast. And these are also potential areas for potential Chinese mining contracts within exclusive economic zones. Alternatively, in close proximity, you have the cases, again, of the Cook Islands, but also Kiribati, which are shown with the red flags. And these are diplomatic and defense partnerships that the PRC has identified. Now, switching over to the map that's on the right, you see Hawaii, where the US has, again, significant military presence. And its exclusive economic zone is within close proximity to the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, where there are many ISA contract sites. So China has established its presence within the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. And this is seen, so from the island of Hawaii to CMC's or China Minerals Corporation's A5 contract area that is roughly 600 miles to Hawaii shore or only 400 miles outside of US EEZ territory. And then finally, the final example that's not pictured on this slide, but it will be shown on the next slide, is Beijing Pioneer's contract areas of M1, M2, C1, and C2, which sit at the closest US infrastructure with around less than 400 miles east of the Northern Mariana Islands, and then also less than 800 miles north of the Kofa country of Micronesia, and around 1,000 miles northwest of the Marshall Islands. So now, when it comes to China's ISA contract sites, if it is really this idea of, if it's really truly just a research endeavor to explore deep sea mining potential, then what is its potential risk to US national security? And this idea came, so when I mapped the Chinese ISA contract sites, the correlation of PRC sites and the potential partnerships near US assets wasn't the only trend that emerged. You can see on this map, as well as you might have noticed before, that many of the ISA contract sites have important undersea fiber optic cables that run through them. And these are represented by the red lines. This brings up significant concerns of potential Chinese sabotage or espionage on these cables. And then these fiber optic cables are not only used by the Department of Defense for strategic communications, but many are owned by major US corporations. So around the time that I was conducting my research, there was a New York Times article that came out in July, which tracked the movements of one of China's civilian research and survey vessels, Xiangyang Hong 6, and its movements within 2024. So through analyzing this map that was produced of its movements, which is shown on the right in comparison to the map on the left, you can see that the Xiangyang Hong 6 was not only collecting research in and around areas of Chinese ISA contract sites, which are highlighted by these yellow boxes over here on the left map, and the orange box to the east of Guam. So this larger orange box was where the Xiangyang Hong 6 was surveying, and then in its correlation onto this map is roughly this area where the Chinese ISA contract sites are. Now, you also may notice that on the Xiangyang Hong 6 map of its areas that it surveyed, there's also a smaller orange box that appears to the west of Guam. Now, when you put roughly the same area that this box appears onto this map over here, there is no Chinese ISA contract sites over there, but instead there is numerous deep sea fiber optic cables. So this is really an important idea of that, since a lot of these are specifically owned by US companies. And so then going to the third implication, taking these two other policy implications into mind, another reason why deep sea mining is presenting a strategic area for China to focus on specifically is many of the same reasons why the US is looking into deep sea mining. And this is in order to shore up their supply chains from vulnerabilities. Even though China controls many of the processes and many of the areas of the supply chain for terrestrial critical minerals, their supply chains still have many vulnerabilities. And then also for China to gain market dominance in this new sector. So if China becomes the dominant player in deep sea mining, this additionally creates the potential for China to lock the US out of the marketplace, and a marketplace that's especially critical to defense manufacturing. This potential lockout has already been seen through the use of terrestrial critical minerals as a defensive means through export controls. Further, China's strengthening of key strategic deep sea mining partners in Pacific Island countries creates opportunities for the PRC to have alternative supply chain lines for their own critical mineral reserves, but also this reduces the possibility that the US could effectively counter and target China's supply lines of critical minerals and reduce Chinese access to minerals that are strategic to their national security. So then lastly, where do we go from here? So this is a very fast-moving industry, as well as it's had many developments within the last month or so. So for example, I finished this paper within mid-July, and in the month and a half or so that has happened since then, there's been numerous developments that have happened. So for example, the US government has expanded their looking into commercialized permits within EEZs, as well as expanded US diplomatic collaboration within the area. So the US and the Cook Islands recently came together and released a joint memorandum of understanding. This is a really interesting development because the Cook Islands also had a memorandum of understanding with China as well. And so it's going to be an interesting competition to see who is able to actually gain the ability to mine within the Cook Islands EEZs, or which country has access to the Cook Islands ISA contract sites in the end. And then you also see this new interest in US corporations applying for ISA permits, and their renewed interest in using existing contracts. So for example, Lockheed Martin actually owns a permit, a contract area within the Clarion-Clipperton zone. And so for a while, they weren't very interested in using this at all. But within the last month or so, there has been talks of them renewing interest within looking towards mining within this contract site. And so, this is really significant because it's really the opportunity, I believe, that it's a new area of strategic competition between the US and China. And it's a key potential emerging market for the US specifically to decouple from China's terrestrial critical mineral supply chain dominance and to secure critical minerals that are strategic to the defense industrial base. The US additionally has the potential to become a leader within the deep sea mining industry through developing the different processing industries and setting precedent within the market. And that's all that I have. Thank you. And I believe now that we will move into our question portion of the webinar.
Wow, Lucia, thank you. That was really interesting. So I'm assuming we're going to have some questions here. So down in the middle of your screen, you'll see that there's a row of icons. And so if you click on the hand, that will put you in our Q&A queue, and I will go ahead and call on people one-on-one. Let's see. All right, Bob, let's go ahead and start with you.
Thank you. Unless there's a provocation by China, it's economic competition. And you're talking about them cutting the potential to cut the communication lines, fiber optics. Russia's been doing that apparently up in the Baltic, right? So I wonder where you stand. Are you talking provocation or economics primarily?
So I think mainly when it comes to specifically the You're talking about the deep sea fiber optic cables, right?
Right. I mean, because they're out there, of course, they can cut, and that you
Yes.
brought that up. That's one of your key points. But I mean, they have the right to deep sea mine, and deep sea mine, you mean offshore where it's not so deep, right? That's where they get the rights from the islands. So yes, they can cut the fiber optics, but and they're going to be just more out there. Is that so? What I'm asking is, are you mainly going at this from a defense provocation point of view or economic advancement?
I'm looking at this mainly from a defense and kind of its the areas that, you know, how deep sea mining it has the potential to for China specifically to kind of spread their influence, but within a defense way, because and to undermine U.S. defense presence. Specifically talking about the deep sea fiber optic cables, a lot of this like surveying of the cables in this area, you know, China has cut cable lines, or there's been accidents of the deep sea fiber optic cables, but the cables are also really easy to like swipe information off of. And so this has been like a significant concern to national security experts recently as well. And so it's an area that, you know, if China has this ability to deep sea mine, which they're allowed to have under in being an ISA signatory, it's interesting that their contract areas are in such close proximity to U.S. assets, specifically because you ask for where your contract site area is.
Thank you.
Well, all right, Dwayne, you're up next.
Yeah, hi. I don't know if my mic is on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Two questions. First of all, at the very beginning, the first slide where you listed the critical minerals, you mentioned antimony, but it wasn't on the slide. I'm just curious about why that is.
Yeah, I can look. I'll go back to that slide. So basically in my report, it's gonna take a minute to get there. But in my report, I listed all of the critical minerals in a table and looking at, you know, the areas where the U.S. is looking to just like where specifically this table talked about, you know, what are the leading countries that produce these critical minerals, as well as, okay, sorry, there we go. And so a lot of this information some of it was really hard to find of where specifically these, where we import our critical minerals from and how much reliance we have on there. So if I know I mentioned it, it's not in this table because I was having trouble finding those things. I was using a lot of US Geological Survey reports. And so not all the information is out there, as I had mentioned. So that's the reason why it's missing from this.
Okay, just for your information, I don't know if this helps or not, but as far as antimony goes, 100% of it that the U.S. uses currently is imported. Most of it from China. Zero of it is produced or mined in the United States at the present time, although there are 2 or 3 companies that are planning to start mining antimony within the next few years. So whatever that's worth. The other question I have, though, is more general. What I'm wondering is, has this presentation, has this information been provided to the U.S. Department of Defense?
It has not, to my knowledge. It was published online, and I gave the presentation to some people within the national security sphere, mainly academics, but also some government officials, as well as people from the private sector. And then again, it was published online. So to my knowledge, it has not been, but I'm also not sure exactly who has read the report.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Kiran, you're up next.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lucia. It's a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. One thing which has concerned me is all this island nations, their energy needs are provided by imported diesel oil, and
Mhm.
any kind of processing, may exceed the national consumption. And I was wondering, to your, while you were researching, was there any thought of U.S. looking into floating nuclear power plants for this, say, Samoa area, such that it will supplement any kind of processing which you want to do right on the ocean, reducing the cost rather than, in general, the question is, what will be the energy implications of processing these minerals, and how is United States is looking into its own unique position, because as you know, through executive orders, there's a lot of push towards nuclear energy in the last 4 or 5 months or so. And companies, one European company and maybe 2 European companies are specifically looking into floating nuclear power plants. And when I say floating, we are talking about 40, 50 megawatt class electric power. I was just curious whether you have come across that kind of strategy on a part of the US to use floating nuclear power plants,
Yeah, so when I was doing a lot of my research, I was focusing specifically on I focused less on the scientific background of like going into more of the technology of that realm. And I focused more on the policy and the geopolitical implications. So, I haven't specifically looked at, the strategies per se that the U.S. is looking towards deep sea mining and and its processing and refinement, whether that's onshore or offshore processing and refinement. But I know a lot of corporations are looking into that specifically.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like we had a couple of questions or comments, at least in the messages. So we answered Dwayne's. So faithful and true production. Is that a question? Would deep sea mining translate to deep space mining? I'm not sure if that's in your sphere or not, Lucia.
Yeah, that's not really. I'm pretty sure they're very different industries. But yeah, once again, it's not really in what I researched per se.
All right. So Becky had a comment. I think the Cook Islands might consider that they will have access to their EEZ resources. I know, Becky, you typed that at one specific point. Did you want to ask a specific question of Lucia with that?
Not really. I was just very aware that we were talking about whether the US or China would have access to the Cook Islands resource, and I think the Islands would maybe think that they have access to their resource with scientific and policy help from others. And it's not a fight between those two, but it's a resource for the islands in their own EEZ.
Yeah, I think they're definitely looking towards partnering with other countries in both ways. So like there is the potential that they could partner with both the US and China specifically in looking towards mining within their EEZs. I think the Cook Islands specifically are just looking to partner with other countries in order to have kind of a little bit more economic support as well as technology and support within this research area of deep sea mining. So it'll be really interesting to see, whether or not they decide to go with both the US and China in collaboration on this, and, whether they're just trying to, really make use of their EEZ resources, or whether they're planning on trying to, necessarily partner with one country over another.
Okay, we have a question from Pratik. I'll just read it out loud. So we have it. Without ISA membership, the U.S. has no formal say in licensing or regulating seabed mining. Doesn't this create a structural disadvantage against China, which is actively using ISA approvals?
Yeah, this is a big area that a lot of people are kind of looking into right now, because they're saying that the U.S. not having ISA membership really limits us, which I believe is pretty true. In the executive order that I mentioned that was passed in April, this is was both a domestic kind of looking into expanded efforts to mine within EEZs, but also the efforts to mine within international waters. And so, a lot of people are saying also that if the US goes into mining in areas beyond national jurisdiction, these international waters, without necessarily, without having the approval of the ISA, this is going to be very much a structural disadvantage of, shaking up the maritime order per se. So a lot of people are warning the US against this, specifically because it will, maybe show, since there hasn't been a lot of regulations on deep sea mining that have come about to fruition. I know the ISA met in July, and there wasn't much movement on kind of what the rules and regulations for deep sea mining will be. And so if the US goes ahead, some people are saying that sets our precedent and we'll be a leader in the industry. I think it also has significant legal implications as well.
Great. All right, Dwayne, you're next up.
Yeah, hi. I don't mean to dominate this, but I actually have this presentation is being sponsored by Impossible Metals. Is that correct? So I actually have a question about Impossible Metals. Would that be appropriate to ask now, or is that a different discussion?
Do you think it's kind of a short question or a long one? Because we do want to get, we can take that offline or get it at the end.
Well, it's a couple short ones, actually. The first one is, my understanding is Impossible Metals right now is a private company. Are there any plans to go public? And if so, when? That's the first question. Second question is, there are other companies that are working on the same things. For example, Odyssey Marine and the Metals Company, or Metals Corporation. Would Impossible Metals be competing with those other companies in the same areas?
Peter? Lucia, we can let Peter get that one. Peter?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I think, first of all, it would be very rare for any companies at this stage to declare whether they're going public or not. I can't answer the question on IPOs and listings. But in terms of competing, I think what we have is certainly competing technologies with the likes of the Metals Company, but we have the same agenda, which is, of course, that we see that deep seabed mining is the least impactful of all mining activities from an environmental perspective. And we just happen to know that and believe that our technology is the most cost efficient and most environmentally safe. So I hope that answers your question. Happy to elaborate if you want.
Yeah, thanks. If I can, though, I understand that you're restricted as far as the financial stuff, but if there were, in theory, if there were going to be an IPO, how would potential investors be notified?
I'm sorry, I just simply cannot answer that question. I can tell you we are a private company right now, and there is nothing out there that says that we are going for an IPO at this stage.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
All right. Justin.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lucia. Great slide deck. Since you've been working in the policy space, my question comes into language, and words matter. And, there's been a lot of, typically the words are deep sea mining, but another approach is sort of deep sea minerals. And I think that gets to the point, right? So disclaimer, I've got some technical advisory role with Impossible, and we're really talking about harvesting, which is picking up things in a way that's different than perhaps digging, which people think of as mining. So my question is, in your work, were you seeing any trends in language and vernacular that maybe policymakers are using, or or is it still sort of a free for all? And like what were the trends and how people talk about this field?
Yeah, so from what I can see so far, I think a lot of people are specifically within the language, are saying just deep sea mining in general. Just I think because it is such a new industry, from the government document, at least that I looked at, as well as some of the testimonials, and the contract sites, that were specifically US focused, a lot of it wasn't necessarily having a difference on like the different types of technologies within deep sea mining, but more just saying in general, either like deep sea mining or like mining within like territorial waters, specifically like mining like the shelf or the crust, like our crusts. So I don't think that there's necessarily, from what I can tell, there isn't necessarily a shift in like policy language right now. I think a lot of people within this space are just trying to figure out kind of what deep sea mining looks like to begin with.
Thank you. That's great.
All right, Jamie.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Mhm.
All right, perfect. So for me, I saw the reference to the executive order, but I'm not sure if we're heading towards more of a comment or more of a question. I was wondering if you had considered the Deep Sea Hard Mineral Resources Act of 1980, and that the US does have a mechanism to administer at least exploration permits in extraterritorial waters. So, I was kind of curious how that kind of played into your analysis.
Yeah, so I did look into the Deep Sea Seabed Hard Minerals Resource Act that came around in the 80s, because this is really, that act specifically is the basis that a lot of people now are using as like the legal justification that this executive order in April, that the US could mine within international waters, due to this act per se. And then that also, I think, if I'm correct, has areas that the US in the 80s identified specifically to deep sea mine. And so I think, if the US does decide to go ahead and start the process of deep sea mining, I think first they're going to go ahead within the processes of mining within their exclusive economic zones, which we have a lot more of those, and we have a lot more area that we can mine within those exclusive economic zones in Oceania than China does. So I think that's kind of the first spot that we're going to go towards. But if we decide to go ahead with deep sea mining, if the government does, then I think that the justification will be highly based upon the legality that is within, the legal justification that is within this act from the 80s. Yeah.
All right. Tom.
Hello. Hi. Really interesting work. I was wondering if you were able to elaborate on the concerns, be they strategic, geopolitical, military, of the sort of physical proximity of contract sites in areas beyond national jurisdiction in a particular island country. I mean, why is that interesting? Why is that a concern?
Yeah, like specifically looking at China, I think it's really important to see how, when we're looking at China, a lot of their resources that are used for research are this idea of dual use. And so within that, a lot of the other countries, they aren't per se, they don't have the same structure or kind of theories of dual use or civil military fusion that China does. And so, it is a security concern that these civilian research vessels, which have a long history within the Indo-Pacific, specifically kind of surveying areas around there. So when you look at those ships, and these same types of ships are being used to mine, to like look at the ocean floor as well as mine, they can they have more than just that ability. They're also able to look at, how the US is postured. They're able to look at these fiber optic cables and take a lot of the information from these fiber optic cables when they're doing this kind of research on the seabed floor. And so I think specifically regarding to China, like, again, that's a big area that's important to security because it's not necessarily an area that we think about per se. I think for some of these other countries within their contract areas, I didn't specifically look at some of the developments that these other countries have contract areas within. But I think, especially within the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, working with our allies and partners that do have ISA contract sites there is an opportunity, again, for the US to kind of establish dominance and maybe kind of establish not necessarily control, but a little bit more of a forceful defense presence or just presence in general within the region.
Yeah, I get that, but like, is it meant to be sort of a ruse or surreptitious? Like, anybody can go cruise around and do what you're talking about. You don't have to have a contract area to do it. So is the idea it's like a lighter touch and somehow less threatening if you're pretending not to do it, and you're just is it like a ruse? Like, China's, yes, there's deep sea mining, but they're also looking through binoculars to the shores of Tonga or something. I mean, I'm just not sure what the deep sea, why do they have to do it like under the guise of seabed mining?
I mean, I think deep sea mining specifically is for them to secure their own supply chains. But it also has the second kind of purpose of being a way that China can specifically, necessarily like spy on the US or like look at other countries and their positioning under. And I think it's important specifically because they're able to gain a little bit more just access to these areas that are closer to US borders. And then if they didn't have this contract area, there would be a little bit more of a suspicion per se.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to emulate this. Ikolu?
Yes, Ekolu Lindsay.
Oh.
Thank you for your presentation. Your presentation is based off of power structures, mineral dominance, and the impacts within the international communities. Did you ever take into consideration, and this might be outside your scope, the impact to environment and cultural resources in these spaces?
I specifically didn't. In a lot of the literature, there is that kind of look into what is the potential impacts, on the environment. What is the impacts? Specifically when the U.S. is looking to mine within our EEZs, a lot of the congressional testimonies and those reports from Bureau of Ocean Energy Management do take into consideration the cultural and the environmental impacts. It is, I would say, outside the scope of what I focus on specifically for this report. But it is something that's really interesting to take into account as well when just looking at the power structures in general and the influence of deep sea mining.
All right, thank you very much. Just for your information, I have attended the ISA. I sat next to the cable guys who are very guarded on their cables, and they will speak up anytime. I've also spoken with U.S. delegations, as well as other delegations for the very thing that you're speaking about. And within the ISA and deep sea mining, there has been very slow movement because it is very difficult to get 34 plus nations on the same page in draft rules and regulations. But it is also important to take your time in providing strict draft rules and regulations so that you can make sure if it's going to be done, it be done mindfully and within international waters under the same rules and regulations that everybody can apply to. But with the United States taking a unilateral decision, then the upsetting, as you stated, within the maritime spaces, it could be potentially very disastrous in the international community, because if the United States takes on the unilateral movements, what's to stop other countries from doing that? But I come to the ISA from a cultural perspective that we should not, because we have the ability to mine the deep sea, that doesn't give us the right to mine it. But disrupting, science has said many things already, for and against, depending on how you interpret their discussions. And Peter just spoke up a little bit. I've spoken with him. Their claim is they have a better methodologies than TMC as far as extracting. But I have seen what an acceptable loss looks like in many different spaces. And sometimes it's just unacceptable for these losses to happen and occur. So for me, I just want you to try to take a look at also the spaces that I just spoke about, both cultural, which is direly missing in these spaces, as well as environmental. But thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, specifically because, if the U.S. was to look into expanding upon the executive order as well as the act from the 80s, I don't necessarily think that it would necessarily take this kind of cultural and environmental consideration into account. And it might just be more of a sense of national security and defense and trying to get ahead in the industry, which I'm not saying that that's necessarily the right way to do it, but I do think that the community and the environment also should be taken into account on whether we go into deep sea mining in general.
One last comment. We're going to rely on something that we did back in the 80s. Things have developed in the 90s and the 2000s. And currently we got the barriers beyond national jurisdiction that has not been completely approved yet, but is very close to approval. So I think we should be focusing on the BB&J, which has more inputs in today's world. But thank you again.
All right, Lucia, we have a question from Pratik in the chat.
Okay. I'm not sure if I see the question.
Okay, I'll read it. How's that? Considering the EO 14285's emphasis on accelerating U.S. seabed mineral capabilities and strengthening alliances, to what extent might China's expanding ISA-approved seabed contracts undermine U.S. strategic autonomy over critical mineral supply chains?
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned this before. I think, right now, China, within its ISA seabed contracts per se, since mining isn't actually taking place, these ISA seabed contracts are more areas that they are doing research into right now. And so I think when it comes to in the future, when it comes to the development of processing industries and refinement industries, if China is ahead of the US on those technologies per se, that's when, it has the potential to undermine US strategic autonomy over these critical mineral supply chains. Specifically because, as you see within terrestrial critical minerals, China has much of the processing and refinement capabilities within their country. And so if, within seabed mining as well, if they develop these and they have kind of the monopoly over this industry, that's going to be another area that within the US, looking at, whether or not we have access to these critical minerals and whether or not we have secure supply chains, an area that kind of, I think, is in development, but it'll be interesting to see how it has played out.
Great. Okay. Any other questions? Well, we've got a minute or so left. If anybody wants to ask a quick one. Okay. All right. Otherwise, Peter's going to close us out. Once he unmutes, there he goes.
As soon as he finds the mute button, yes. Thank you very much. First of all, Lucia, thank you. Honestly, that was exceptional and honestly incredibly educational and well structured. I think I like the framing very much. We understand different aspects because usually in the day-to-day we deal with this from the point of view of a supply demand for metals. We buy from an environmental perspective, obviously. it has gradually evolved into strategic economics, and from there it's moved on to now national security. So the whole debate around deep sea minerals and deep sea metals has evolved over the time, the 15 years that I've been involved with it, certainly. But thank you very much. It was exceptionally interesting, and look forward to seeing what next you come up with. So on that note, thank you for all that tuned into this as well. We will be. I'll just keep an eye out for when Holly organizes the next webinar, and we'll come up with an equally interesting topic.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great weekend.